Hello, everyone, and welcome to this online research seminar hosted by the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the BCLT's Executive Director. Today's speaker is Ian Giles, a translator of Swedish, Norwegian and Danish into English, with some 35 publications to his name. His most recent publications include translations of Arne Dahl, Karin Gerhardsen, Mikkel Katz-Krefeld, Camilla Läckberg, David Lagerkrantz, and Nicholas Nuttall. Ian's doctoral research at the University of Edinburgh explored the impact of translated Scandinavian literature on the British literary market during the 20th and 21st centuries. His research interests include the exploration of translator groupings and collectives, as well as the working terms and conditions for literary translators. Ian served as the chair of the Swedish-English Literary Translators Association, SELTA, from 2018 to 2024. Since 2023, he's been co-chair of the UK Translators Association, the translators' trade union body in the UK, and next week is set to become the TA's sole chair. In November last year, Ian was co-leader with Kari Dixon and Paul Russell-Garrett of our annual BCLT Advanced Translation Workshop, which was Scandinavian themed. Then earlier this year, during the spring of 2024, Ian returned as a visiting fellow at BCLT and the British Archive of Contemporary Writing at UEA, researching and documenting the origins and history of the Translators Association through consultation of the Patricia Crampton papers held in the British Archive for Contemporary Writing. Today's presentation then will offer us a first glimpse into his findings. You'll be aware that this event is being recorded, and we'll be adding the recording to our archive on the BCLT YouTube channel shortly. As ever, I'm grateful to my BCLT colleagues, Anna Good and Sally Dix, for technical assistance. Before I hand over to Ian, let me just say that after his talk, we'll have time for a question and answer session. We're using the Zoom webinar platform, and that allows you to submit questions via the Q&A button, as well as to upvote others' questions that you'd particularly like to see answered. So that function will be available all the way through. Do feel free to submit your questions at any time, and I'll put them to Ian on your behalf at the end. We also have the chat function available during the presentation as well. But for now, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Ian for a talk which is titled Translating the Profession Through the Lens of Patricia Crampton. And as if by magic, Ian, welcome.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I hope that I can keep you all suitably entertained as the hour of darkness draws upon us. I am just going to see if I can share my slides with you without screwing it up, which is, of course, the true test of any speaker. That's going very well so far, of course. There we go. I think perhaps you might now be able to see a covering slide. You can. Excellent. Well, allow me to crack on in that case. I thought rather counterintuitively, or perhaps not, that since I'm promising to look at the translation profession through the lens of Patricia Crampton, that we might start by looking at the translation profession a little bit through Ian Giles and how I came to this project and came to be talking to you today. I see many familiar names amongst the audience, but for those who don't know me, as Duncan has said, I'm a self-employed translator of Swedish, Norwegian and Danish working into English. In the past, that was largely a side hustle while I worked on my PhD at the University of Edinburgh. And back then, my bread and butter work was commercial translation, anything from annual reports to aquaculture marketing, the joy of Norwegian being a source language, of course. I got my literary kick from my research, which was exploring the import of Scandinavian literature to the UK during the 20th and early 21st centuries, and why or why not readers engaged with it. After I submitted my PhD in 2018, my attempts to remain an academic fell somewhat flat, and my long-standing side hustle, which was Plan B, came into action, at least until something better came along, and nothing has done yet. I was eager to move beyond those commercial translation jobs, though, and into more literary and creative translation. And so I've been successful in that, and I've also thrown myself into the voluntary work that you can find adjacent to the literary translation world, including a long stint on the committee of the Swedish-English Literary Translators Association, SELTA. As Duncan mentioned, I literally finished a 6-year term as chair 5 days ago, and I'm currently serving a term on the Translators Association committee as well. So you may be wondering how on earth that leads me to the archives of another translator. Well, my involvement in SELTA and the TA has long had me thinking about how groups like that come about and who the movers and shakers are. Why does it happen? What are the human stories behind them? And what are the history of these organisations, which for most of us are simply there already when we arrive? This was all bubbling away in the back of my mind somewhere, and it had been for a while when, last year, I applied to the BCLT Translator in Residence scheme. My application, it was quite simple. I'd like to see the Crampton papers, please. I'd happened across the existence of them in early 2023 when I was writing a short article about the history of the TA. I hoped they might not only provide me with insights into Crampton herself, but also the history and origins of two key organisations in my translating day-to-day, as well as providing snapshots of other milestones in the 20th century, translational or not. It was exciting to me. It was an opportunity to engage with people, both in the past and present. While I was passionate about my research in the past, I was always much more interested in people. As a researcher, I was quite envious of Ellen Keither's study of Danish to English literary translators. I recommend it to anybody with an interest. While as a translator, I've tended to be drawn to groups precisely because of the people in what can otherwise be a very solitary endeavour. There was an awful lot of me swirling about in my proposal. Ceci Rossi and Anna Good at BCLT were kind enough to suggest that this might better suit a visiting fellowship, and they even more kindly offered me one. So I figured after 6 years out of academia, it was time to return to the fold and engage in a small dose of immersion therapy. I was also particularly keen to erase the memory of the time I got food poisoning while in the archives at Warwick University, where I was looking at the company records of publisher Victor Galantz. What better way could there be? So here I am. What are the Crampton papers? Very briefly, the archive was gifted to the University of East Anglia by Patricia Crampton's family following her death in 2016, and it's now housed, as Duncan mentioned, in the British Archive of Contemporary Writing in the main library on campus at UEA. There are 18 boxes of mixed materials, including both personal and professional correspondence, contracts, memoirs, and all sorts of other ephemera. This is the point where I would show you a photograph of all the materials brought out for me if I had remembered to take one. So here is instead a picture of the sign by the archive. The papers are available to anyone who wants to consult them by appointment. Advertising for the archive itself. So, who was Patricia Crampton the person? I think I ought to preface this by noting, firstly, that I'm aware that there are many of you listening who knew and or met Patricia Crampton while she was alive and working. And I appreciate that I may not be able to encapsulate every element of her multifaceted persona, but I hope I can provide people with some insights into this stalwart of 20th century translation if you're not familiar with her yet. My second caveat here is that while I've gone through these papers in full, when I'm talking more generally about Patricia's biography, I have leaned fairly heavily on her own autobiographical article titled Round the World in 60 Days, which appeared in 2008 edition of Swedish Book Review, which was written by Patricia when she was in her 80s. I've also leaned on obituaries that were published after her death in 2016, and the entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography from 2020, which was authored by archivist and indomitable scholar of Scandinavian children's literature, Dr. Charlotte Berry. So Patricia Crampton, she was born Patricia Wood in Bombay on December the 12th in 1925 to Leslie John Cardew Wood, a civil engineer who later became a colonel in the Royal Engineers, and mother Vera. In her early childhood, Patricia learned Hindi before the family moved back to England in 1930, where they settled in the rather more tame Beaconsfield, and her sister Jennifer was born in 1934. While Patricia's early education was very much as expected in most regards, it was unusual, both for that time and now, that she began learning French more or less as she returned to England at the age of 5. First at High March School, then in her secondary education at Oakdean School in Beaconsfield, where she also added German to her repertoire. Indeed, such were her polyglot skills that the tally of languages she spoke during her lifetime reached 10. I make the count from English, Hindi, French, German, Russian, Spanish, Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. She herself noted that she didn't acquire any new languages after the age of 27. But, excuse me. But during childhood, it was clear that translation was on the horizon from an early stage. In a piece headed, "What are you going to do when you grow up?" Crampton says, "There were a few years when the answer was stay at home with mummy and go to dances. I must have been about 14 when the answer became be a translator. I'm not quite sure how that moment arrived, because it's fairly certain that when I was 14, somewhere around 1940, very few English people would have heard of translation as a profession." Excuse me. I must deal with that frog in my throat. Nonetheless, her gifts were apparent to all, and she passed her higher education certificate in 1942, aged 16. During the Second World War, like many of her peers, she contributed to the war effort. She unofficially worked with the Home Guard, she helped out in a munitions factory during the holidays, she even volunteered with the Voluntary Aid Detachment. Her father, in the meantime, the colonel, was running a special operations executive station. Despite being engaged in all of this, Patricia, like many other teenagers, had moments of doubt about staying in school rather than joining the war effort full time. And this was very much something that hit home when her boyfriend, Bob Cosgrave, a bomber pilot and the older brother of her best friend, died just before she left for Oxford University. In 1943, she arrived at St Hugh's to study French, German, and Russian. Though she was a capable student, she later admitted that she hadn't attended lectures after her first term. I have to say, it's something I can sympathise with. Despite this, she thoroughly enjoyed her time at Oxford, even though she missed out on opportunities to study abroad due to the war. She reflects on this point in her life at some length in an audio deposition that she made in the Imperial War Museum's archives, and you can find that online if you Google and stream it. It's well worth a listen. Not long before she left Oxford in 1946, her college principal reputedly asked her, "Is there such a profession?" when she mentioned a translation as a future career prospect. In the interim, Crampton fulfilled her immediate desire to travel by moving to Sweden for 3 months, where she stayed with several families, taught English, and developed a keen, lifelong interest in Swedish. Why Sweden? Well, her father forbade her to go to France or Germany, too war-torn in his opinion. Fortunately, she had a get-out. A group of Swedish army officers visited Oxford during her final year, and she was tasked with escorting them to various functions. The colonel in charge invited Patricia to call if she was ever in Sweden, and after showing her own father, Colonel too, remember, a letter supposedly sent by this Swedish colonel off she went. In her Swedish Book Review retrospective, she describes with vivacity her experiences in Sweden in 1946 and her thrill at encountering Swedish society. You would think those would be the seeds sown for a life as a literary translator. That was actually to come later. Patricia Crampton, the commercial translator, is where we need to go first. On her return to England from Sweden, it was time to find a job. And while she'd fallen for Swedish, it was actually her German that she wanted to rely upon for a living. Sent to the Higher Appointments Board in Tavistock Square, they were eager to dispatch her to the World Council of Churches. Crampton, however, notes that she needed, and the word needed is underlined, to get to Germany, and was told that in that case the Nuremberg war crimes trials needed 2 more translators to work German into English. Having passed a written test using her dictionary with Gothic script and 19th century terminology, she was sent off to Germany. Driven to Northolt Aerodrome by her mother to board a military plane to Bavaria, her mother's parting words were, "You will come straight back, won't you, darling, if there's anything nasty?" We've got a couple of pictures from the archive here of Patricia while working in the translation section in Nuremberg. Her work as a document translator involved primarily translating for the doctor's trial from 1946 to 47, and then a lot of work for the trial of the chemicals company Aegir Fabern that came after that. In many of her own writings, Crampton's more than aware of the uncomfortable and unsettling nature of the crimes being tried and the documents she was tasked with working on. But my impression is that the job needed to be done and she pressed on nonetheless. Ultimately, as she notes at one point, this being her first job in life, it all seemed as if it were perfectly normal. Here she is, ice skating in her off time. Her time in Nuremberg also came with opportunity. She notes in one draft memoir that her choice of Germany was, quote, "firstly for linguistic reasons, secondly because of the US-style untaxed pay, and thirdly from interest." That tax-free American pay came in useful, along with a plethora of public holidays and a generous petrol allowance, in that it allowed her to travel widely in Central Europe at a time when that was not possible for many. It was a very eventful period in her personal life too, including an engagement to the German author Wolfgang Hildesheimer, which was broken off when Crampton's father discovered that his son-in-law-to-be was a Jew. And yes, we have the display at the archive at University of East Anglia showing the letter between Wolfgang and Patricia after their engagement has been broken off. We've got one of Wolfgang's books. She went on to be his translator later on. Now, I'm conscious that I'm glossing over a wealth of events and details about Crampton's years in Germany here. The papers include many of our own reflections on that time, an assortment of photographs, many of the letters that she wrote to her parents, letters between her and Hildesheimer, and much, much more. It's a real treasure trove. Perhaps someone will write a biography of her, or, it struck me as I read through it, perhaps a novel based on those years of her life. To quote Crampton on the years, "I had an amazing 2 years, privileged, shocking, life-changing. Spent all my spare time with a very special group of friends who are lovingly traced in a more personal memoir, and returned in 1949 to my own beloved country where everyone, including my own parents, preferred not to ask, not to think, not to know anything at all about the death camps and everything that preceded them." As a translator, I think we can conclude that Nuremberg was quite the apprenticeship for Patricia Crampton. Over the next 6 years, she worked in a variety of translation roles. She was head of translation at British American Tobacco, even though she notes that the department consisted solely of her. After a job translating monthly bulletins for an engineering firm, she wound up as a translator and conference organizer for NATO, which entailed a lot of work in Paris. And it was in those NATO circles that she eventually met the sculptor Sean Crampton, her husband-to-be, and they married in 1959. So that perhaps brings us to Patricia Crampton, the literary translator. Sean Crampton, as I mentioned, was a sculptor, and that meant he was a freelancer. And this saw Patricia settle into freelance life as well. Writing years later, she said, "From my husband, a sculptor who had set his own rules many years earlier, I learned the discipline of freelance work. Finishing the translation of a book seemed to me a signal for celebration. From him, I learned that it simply freed you for the next piece of work." In her earliest stages of freelancing, for the first time in the literary sphere, she produced many readers' reports of foreign titles on behalf of UK publishers. This work was doubtless supported by her ongoing work on commercial and technical texts, drawing on her experiences from the preceding 15 years. Her first literary commission, however, came about when she happened upon the publisher Jonathan Cape by chance, and he tasked her with translating Jürgen Hulk's The Small Flag from Danish in 1960. As she later noted, this was also her first lesson in the fractious relationship that could arise between publisher and translator. The publisher cut the final paragraph from the published English, yet it was the paragraph in the source that had most resonated with Crampton in the first place. This informed her desire later on to secure a robust model contract for translator-publisher relationships. It also marked the beginning of a prolific career as a literary translator. She translated in the region of 200 children's books and a further 50 books for adults. As you may be able to tell from these figures, it was as a translator of children's literature that she really found her stride. She wrote, "It was when the children arrived that a publisher friend realised before I did that I would care mightily about children's literature. It was, where translation is concerned, a new motivation, a need to work not just for the words, but for their readers, to give them the best available." Writing elsewhere, she also noted that, quote, "It is only as a child that most of us have the time to curl up with an apple or a bar of chocolate and lose ourselves in a book." Yet another source for her passion was that, quote, "Sometimes the children's literature of other countries is doing something which, at a particular time, ours is not." Suffice to say, she was a woman on a mission. Her children's authors included many writers of import, including Anna Holm and Gudrun Passavang, but she's probably best remembered for being one of Astrid Lindgren's main translators and for being the translator of the Dutch author Dick Bruna and his Miffy books. I think we have a picture of Miffy. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Methuen had published Bruna's picture books, particularly his increasingly popular Miffy stories. Alongside each illustration, Bruna would always include 4 lines of Dutch rhyming verse. However, his editor at Methuen always denied it was possible to translate these lines into corresponding English verse. Bruna had grown to accept Methuen's English versions in prose, even though he believed strongly that young children remember stories in rhyme far more easily. One day, he happened to see an English translation of a book that a Dutch psychologist had written analysing his work. Surprised and impressed, Bruna discovered Patricia Crampton had translated his Dutch verse into perfect English metre, and thus began their long working relationship. He had 40 of his past books to retranslate, this time into English verse. So it was no surprise that among her many awards and prizes as a literary translator, several were for her work with children's literature. This included the Mildred Batchelder Awards for Best Translated Children's Book in the USA, the Marsh Award here in the UK, IBI distinctions, as well as the Federation of International Translators Lindgren Prize for services to the translation of children's literature, and the Eleanor Farjan Award for services to children's literature as a whole. But I think, given my own interest, it's only right to reflect on Crampton's interest in excuse me, in translator associations and institutions. It was her second book translation, Naked in Piccadilly, which she translated from Spanish in 1961, that caught the attention of George Astley. Astley had worked in intelligence during the war, but having given up on his acting dreams by the late 1940s, he ended up taking a job at the Society of Authors somewhat by chance in 1956. He was a key figure in the groundwork that led to the establishment of the Society of Authors subgroup known as the Translators Association in 1958, and he was its first secretary, serving for many years. Astley's own importance to the nascent TA shouldn't be underestimated. During his tenure until retiring in 1980, he oversaw the emergence of the group from scratch, the development of several key translation prizes, and the implementation of various initiatives such as a model contract. More on that in a bit. As Crampton puts it in her own tribute to him, published in Other Words in 1994 after his death, Astley invited her to drop into Drayton Gardens, the old home of the Society of Authors, having seen a review of her Spanish novel, and he flattered her into joining. Reportedly, this was one of his most successful recruitment ploys, deployed frequently in the early days. Isabel Quigley's obituary of Astley notes he was recognised for his financial prowess at the Society of Authors, and given that Crampton went on to remain a member for more than 50 years, perhaps that description of him was justified. Patricia first joined the TA committee, which is the steering group responsible for the organisation's work, in 1970. And I think we can say her impact must have been considerable, given that she was then invited to join the Society's full management committee in 1972. She was the chair of the Translators Association 3 times during the course of her membership, and she also served as the deputy chair of the Society of Authors as a whole from 1978 to 1981, not to mention many innumerable years spent on the TA committee when she was not the chair. The achievements of the TA were the fruits of both George Astley and the committee's labours. As Patricia put it, you worked flat out for the TA and George backed you to the hilt. Astley himself noted in a letter to the Times Literary Supplement in 1974 that the TA's 350 members were able to present a united front and bring considerable pressure to bear in improving working conditions for literary translators. He added, quote, "A great deal of wind and print is expended in passing resolutions and theorising on what the translator's status in the literary community should be. But it seems to be us more practical to get down to brass tacks and deal with the unpublicised day-to-day work as regards contracts, credits, fees, and the many other difficulties which arise. These activities can and do, slowly but surely, improve the general situation." Successes in those first 2 to 3 decades included ensuring that translators were indemnified by publishers against lawsuits that arose as a result of content in the original work. This came from the Hotcouth libel case in 1971. There was widespread cooperation with other organisations, including the Translators Guild, the forerunner to the ITI, especially in terms of joint lobbying on issues that related to translation. There was the application of pressure in various political spheres to dramatically improve the rights of the self-employed in Britain in the 1970s. There was lobbying that resulted in the Publishers Association recognising that translators ought to retain their copyright in the translation, which is where we can largely see the development of payments of advances against royalties being made rather than lump sum on work for hire terms in the UK. There was the development of the public lending right, which, for those who don't know, is the payment for library loans in the UK to the original creator, which included a 1/3 share payable to the translator of a translated work if it was borrowed. and there was the development of the model contract, not to mention the institution of new translation prizes and considerable efforts across the board to promote translated literature and the translators thereof. Many of these efforts featured Crampton at the forefront. Through the TA, as well as the Institute of Linguists Translators Guild, which she helped to make the transition to being the ITI in 1985. Crampton was also chair of the Guild at various junctures. One of the most noteworthy examples of her involvement was the implementation of the UNESCO recommendation for the protection of translators and their copyright, known more commonly as the Nairobi recommendations. She and George Astley more or less single-handedly managed to change the British government's view on the recommendations and bring about significant change as a result. Later on, efforts by the TA that involved Patricia included efforts to merge with the Translators Guild itself on the basis that it would make for a stronger outward face for translators, as well as contributing to discussions around a mooted merger between the Writers Guild and the Society of Authors in the early 1990s. Efforts to ensure that British institutions of higher education recognised literary translation as a research output in their assessments also followed, along with other measures that reflected the development of literary translation both as a more marketable service and as an academic discipline. In the case of the former, this included efforts to produce a printed directory in collaboration with the ITI in the 90s, while in the case of the latter, there were many proposed attempts at collaboration with the BCLT itself, including a potential national database of literary translators. Of course, those with long memories in the audience will also remember that the TA's journal, In Other Words, ended up being hosted and published by the BCLT. Crampton's involvement in groups didn't stop there. She was involved extensively in other international groupings, including several years spent as chair of the FIT Copyright Committee. And when she felt there were shortcomings, she made them known. Minutes from a meeting of the TA committee in the early 1990s record, quote, Patricia pointed out that other international organisations tend to regard the TA as aloof for staying away from and contributing so little to international translators' affairs. She felt that should be sorted out. But it's to the Swedish language that I'd like to turn. Apparently not yet sated by all this work that she was doing, be it voluntary improvement of her profession, be it translating millions and millions of books, she set her sights on another target. While associations for translators, literary or otherwise, were commonplace in the decades that followed the Second World War, groups focused on a single language pair were rather less common. In the case of Swedish, there were a couple of subgroups in the mainstream commercial translation associations in the UK and Sweden that facilitated the interests of Swedish-English translators, but there was nothing independent. The first impetus for bringing translators of Swedish together actually came not from the translators, but from the Swedish Embassy in London and cultural attaché Ove Svensson, who joined forces with the Swedish Institute and held a conference for translators and publishers in 1978. In 1981, the next cultural attaché, Terry Karlbom, arranged a translators conference at the University of Hull, and in November that same year, he ran a seminar which led to the setting up of SELTA the very next morning. Among the original founders was Patricia Crampton. By the time of the first AGM, which took place in April 1982, SELTA had 9 full members and 3 associate members. An early member of the committee of SELTA, Patricia was then chair from 1992 to 1996, and she was a frequent member of the committee until the mid-2000s. While SELTA's activities and membership have varied since its inception, it's remained dedicated to its core aims of bringing together translators of the Swedish language in one obvious place and promoting Swedish language literature. This has included the publication of the journal Swedish Book Review, which used to look like this in print. These days you can find it online at swedishbookreview.org. My editor would like you to say that you would like to subscribe, so do that after this talk. and there have been a lot of other initiatives. As an early members newsletter from 1982 says, the more members we have, the stronger the position we shall be in to influence publishers and cultural bodies, and the more we shall be able to do to spread awareness of Swedish literature, promote translation, and provide information on current conditions and events in the field of Swedish-English translation. These days, we have more than 80 members, and we've been delighted to help drive through the boost in translated Swedish literature that's taken place over the past 2 decades, much of it thanks to the groundwork of translators like Patricia Crampton and the years before that. And just last week, and this is a snap from the Scottish Poetry Library last Friday, we hosted a workshop in Edinburgh for about 25 translators of Swedish, including 3 invited authors from Sweden, as we translated texts with themes of memory and voice. Without that structure and framework of SELTA, I really don't think events like this would have happened. So, that's SELTA. But one of the really important achievements in SELTA's early years as an organisation was actually the establishment of the Bernard Shaw Prize for Swedish to English translation. That was initially awarded triennially. These days, it's awarded biennially, worst word ever, following recent pressure from us and the increase in the number of Swedish books being translated to English. In 1988, Crampton proposed that a prize be set up with the suggestion that the Society of Authors might administer it. After a failed attempt to secure funding from the Swedish Publishers Association, a successful application to the Anglo-Swedish Literary Foundation followed. Now, this foundation was established to fulfil the wishes of George Bernard Shaw to use his Nobel Prize money for the promotion of the literature and art of Sweden in Great Britain. And the entire sum, 118,165 Swedish krona, was donated. Patricia rather liked this connection, and permission was obtained from the Bernard Shaw estate to attach his name to the prize. And the initial award was based on books from the previous 10-year period. But this was ultimately an endeavour that brought further in focus onto the work of translators rather than exclusively the authors of the original works. And it helped to elevate the status of Swedish as a source language, having spent much of the second half of the 20th century being a little bit overlooked when compared to its bigger European siblings. It's also important to note Crampton's work in other respects in the world of translation prizes. She notably served 8 years on the jury, 4 of them as president for the Hans Christian Andersen Prize. Having secured the future of the Bernard Shaw Prize, she was a judge for several iterations once she was no longer a translator in contention in her own right. In the case of the Astrid Lindgren Prize, awarded by the International Federation of Translators, which Crampton won, she then set about lobbying both Astrid Lindgren herself and the FIT to enhance the rules around the prize to ensure its future integrity. Click. In advance of this talk, I received an email from the translator of French, Ros Schwartz, whom I'm sure many of you know, and she shared with me what an inspiration Patricia had been to her. And I thought she might enjoy the fact that while digging, I unearthed the spring 1989 edition of Tahiti, the not that long-lived joint newsletter of the TA and the ITI, which notes an idea for a Best Book in Translation prize to be awarded annually. The brief item included a call for suggestions of suitable sponsors to provide £50,000 to support the prize. I have to say this sounds very much like what the International Booker eventually went on to become in 2016, so I salute your forethought. And while the news item commends Ros as the driver of this, if I may read between the lines, I have every certainty that Patricia's penchant for prizes and translator promotion will have been at the back of Ros's mind at the time. So, I've explored Patricia's life, her work, and her good and great deeds for translator kind, but I'd like to dip in and out of the papers in a few different spots to highlight some of the things that stood out to me as I worked my way through these papers. Well, firstly, there's the joys and frustrations of translating as a whole. And I think that these are ones that we can very much relate to, but these were two of my favourites. Firstly, her recognition that the translator's life can generally be quite a lonely one. But my favourite was confessions. I must have made 1,000 mistakes that no one spotted. Very much one I can sign up to. Now, it turns out publishers will always need the manuscript last week. I'm sure this is a feeling that many translator colleagues will share with me. Publishers are always in an unreasonable rush. Charitably, we can assume it's excitement about the text. I'm afraid, though, that Crampton's papers tell us it was ever thus. Writing to Lindgren's publisher Gilly Gooding at Methuen in 1979, Crampton wrote, "I don't know what your other translators do, but had I been free to start that day, which of course I'm not, and to throw Christmas overboard, it would have left me 8 weeks. I would certainly need 10 for an Astrid Lindgren of this length, and even then I hate rushing it." She then went on to propose a delivery deadline that was 5 months later than the one the publisher had suggested. No one ever pays enough, and we have to explain to would-be buyers that they must pay. Some of you may have spotted this one earlier. Recalling her early years as a freelance translator after she married Sean in 1959, Crampton noted that she learned about being poor. And quote, and you'll see this is capped, "Literary translation is not a paying profession, even when it takes every hour of your day and half the hours of the night." This was certainly something that remained at front and centre as the years progressed. Addressing a group of technical translators in 1972, Crampton noted that pay for technical was better than literary, but royalties and job satisfaction were at least perks of literary translation. The success in persuading publishers that translators should retain copyright evidently helped a little, as did the introduction of public lending right, but these weren't balms to all the ills of the world. By the late 1970s, Crampton was on the one hand prepared to accept a rate of £7 per 1,000 words from one publisher, while she negotiated with the publisher of Lindgren to secure a rate of £12 per 1,000 for doing the latest book from Sweden there. In 1982, while negotiating terms for the translation of Wolfgang Hildesheimer's Marbut, which we saw in that picture of the display earlier, the acquiring publisher at J.M. Dent complained that her demands were breaking the framework of the costing of this book due to commitments they had already made to the author. I'm sure there are many of you listening today who will recognise the regular battle with a publisher who says that the terms agreed in the head contract preclude a translator royalty. No wonder that Crampton welcomed diversification in who the commissioners were. Foreign publishers are gradually moving towards the idea of producing the English translations, and the most vital, obviously, for the world market, at their own expense. This is lovely for us. Foreign publishers are able to pay the proper rate for the job without pain, and some of them are more willing to adapt themselves to the idea of leaving the translator in possession of his copyright. We all just want to be paid better, or to have cashews. And then it's very interesting to me to have seen how frequently Crampton was at pains to note that she was a translator and not a writer. And indeed, given how frequently that assumption was levelled at her. Addressing that group of technical translators, Crampton was asked from the floor whether she was a writer manqué, and the piece reports that Mrs. Crampton said that she was not at all creative, no muse visited her. It was the same tune a few years later in 1978 when she was asked whether she was a frustrated author, and she answered truthfully that she was not and was satisfied instead as a very minor actress for as long as I am translating a children's book. In one of her memoir drafts, she concludes, "And yes, I am a translator, not a writer, and no, I have no regrets." Well, then there's the thorny, topical issue of encroaching technology. Crampton often ruminated on the future of translation, the threat posed by technology, and what it meant to be a human translator. And in a piece by her titled Translator, Man or Machine, that appeared in a supplement to the April 1979 edition of British Book News, she reflected at length. And this is worth just looking at this quotation. "The question is not asked consciously. Probably only the translator is aware that many of his customers honestly don't know the difference. At some stage in our career, most translators have heard the comment from a miserly client. £5, I could have got the office boy to look the words up in a dictionary. The answer is 4 simple syllables. Why didn't you? In fact, the translation machine, even at its present stage of development, would do a great deal better than the office boy, but the answer to that 4-syllable question, which must apply equally to machine translation, probably lies in the genesis as well as in the experience and progress in work of the human translator. So we might start with these. In the case of this translator knows best. It's a very pragmatic article, and I really, if you happen upon your 1979 issues of British Book News, I do suggest you read it. But in closing, she says, the business of the human translator then turns out not to be business at all. It turns out to be from first to last a love affair, first with language and languages, and then with the work of the author. Well, I find myself treading many of the same paths taken by Crampton, SELTA, the TA, the Society of Authors. While we were on this earth for 26 concurrent years until Crampton died in 2016, we never met. While I had course-to-exchange correspondence with a number of now dearly departed translators during my PhD years, including the late, great Laurie Thompson, I never wrote to Crampton. And yet, as I worked through her papers, I found it fascinating the parallels that there were between then and now. Now, first and foremost, she noted with emphasis in her own retrospective from Swedish Book Review that, and I quote, breakfast is important. This is a sentiment that I can get on board with. Writing in 1999, she also remarked upon being incredibly grateful to have had a career which has taken me all over the world and brought me into contact with stimulating situations and passionately committed translators. This is certainly another sentiment I can get on board with. I already mentioned my like of people, and it really was a privilege for me to spend time at BCLT and in Norwich and to explore Norfolk and to meet such wonderful people. Here are some of my holiday snaps. But thinking about Patricia, it's obvious in her approach to work as a translator that she brought an awful lot with her later in life from her early formative experiences in Nuremberg. The ability to get up close with something so unsettling while turning out the best job that she could, and I'd wager that probably informed much of what she went on to do. While it's a very different situation, I've also been surprised by how much I've brought to my translation practice from what I think of now as my own apprenticeship of researching and writing a PhD. It's about practicing thinking at a young stage and then applying it to your translation. Crampton also makes clear at various points that her work as a reviewer and scout, whether informally or formally, very much helped to develop her reputation. And I like to think that one of the ways in which I've been able to get a foot in the door in the present day has also been to provide both publishers interested in Scandinavian literature in the UK and Scandinavians trying to get into Britain, that bridge, that level of intelligence and understanding of what there is flying across the North Sea in literary terms. And then there's the power of the group. Crampton saw the value in translators aligning themselves in what can often be regarded as an industry where it's every man or woman for themselves. And in that respect, I certainly see her point of view. It's particularly striking, though, how she emphasises that she's a translator and not a writer, and perhaps we can see that in all her efforts alongside her translation to better the translator's lot, rather than charting a course with her own stuff. Oh, that frog is annoying. After the death of Patricia's husband in 1999, she stopped translating, with the exception of Bruner's Miffy books, which she had agreed to keep translating as he completed them, including the backlog. The last of her translated manuscripts is dated 2010. Crampton noted that without Sean, it just wasn't the same. She said, there had been some particular magic about the 40 years of freelance work in harmony in our own home. It's a reminder for us practicing translators of the importance of those around us, both personally and professionally. So, what can we draw from the Crampton papers as we think about the profession as it is then and now. Oh no, I'm not at the end yet. There's the same joys and frustrations. There's still that suspicion that translators could just be writers who couldn't cut it. There's the issues of encroaching technology, turf issues as we human translators come under threat. Publishers always in a rush and never paying enough. And translators being stronger when they come together and discuss their issues and present a united front. And the difference is, it strikes me, it'd be very unusual now for a professional translator to work with so many different source languages, especially when lacking formal training in so many of them. Communications, there are so many of them. I'm sure this is something that will be familiar to all of you. I spent a lot of my time sitting in that archive thinking that there's no way that my emails could end up in an archive like these letters and faxes had. I'd also say that commercial and literary translation have probably pulled away from each other rather more so now, where there was an easygoing overlap in the past. And then culturally and historically, it strikes me that it's unlikely that anyone will be placed in that kind of era of opportunity as Europe rebuilt itself after World War II again, that made so much of her early professional years so exciting. There are some universal truths, though, that we can pull out. One of my favourite snippets is a fax sent to Crampton when she was TA chair in the early 1990s, and she'd left a meeting early to catch her train. The fax was to inform her that once she had left, the committee had changed its mind on a key issue. So if you're in charge, the lesson here is don't leave your meeting early, be it on Zoom or be it in person. But I think that looking through Crampton's papers illustrated to me that translation is about more than words. It's about navigating relationships and the evolving role of the translator. It was my pleasure to take a look at the scenes behind the curtain of her work as a translator, and it was fascinating to find out so much about someone who lived in a time that was so close to our own, and yet one that in many respects feels so very different. The past really is a foreign country, although now that we find ourselves in the future, so to speak, I wonder if Crampton might feel the same way about our time. Concluding her 2008 memoir in Swedish Book Review, she wrote, "In 1947, when I started work, translation was still officially described in Britain as a craft industry. There are now at least a dozen major literary translation prizes and thousands of well-paid jobs in the industry and the international organisations. A linguist's life is not so hard, after all." Words that are perhaps not quite as true today as they were in 2008. So in closing, I would encourage you to pay a visit to the British Archive for Contemporary Writing if you're in Norwich or passing through. Crampton's papers make for a fascinating read, and there is something in them for everyone who is listening to today's talk, regardless of what your interests may be. She was not only a skilled translator and an indefatigable proponent of the profession, she was a fascinating person too. And I'd like to thank a few people. I'd like to thank the Crampton family for depositing this very rich collection of papers for the public good, and my thanks to Kari Dixon and Nariman Youssef, who were translators in residence during my own fellowship, for their good company. Anna Good, Lily Alden, Sally Dix, Ceci Rossi, and Duncan Large of the BCLT for your help and support. Bridget Gillies and Helen Busby in the archive for their excellent archiving and cataloguing, and for all their help while I was there. Janet Garton and BJ Woodstein for drinking caffeine with me while in Norwich. Josephine Murray, who sent me quite a few helpful references. Tom Geddes and Sarah Death, who exchanged emails with me reminiscing about Patricia. And to all the others who expressed such a keen interest in the project when they heard about it at events and gatherings during the winter and spring earlier this year. And obviously, most importantly, thank you to the BCLT for funding the fellowship in the first place. And that's what I have to say, but I really look forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Ian, thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions from our audience. We do have plenty of time to deal with them. We have at least half an hour. So can I invite our audience, please, to raise any questions that you might have for Ian? Please, by preference, pop them in the Q&A. While you're doing that, Ian, you got so much out of the archive. You mentioned that there might be a novel in it, or there would certainly be a kind of full-scale biography. Are you tempted to write either of those yourself then, or where does this project lead for you?
That's a very good question. I think when you go to an archive, there's always sort of a combination of projection and wishful thinking about what you might find, and that's not all made up out of thin air. You obviously take a look at the catalogue and you cross your fingers. And in my case, yes, I'd also had the pleasure of exchanging emails with someone who'd had a look at the papers before, so I sort of had an inkling of what was going to be. And then you get there, and it's very exciting, but of course it's never quite exactly what you expect. And so actually it provided me with a lot of exciting insight into the early days and the middle days of the Translators Association in particular, which is something that I'm both caters to my own interests, but it's very useful given my current role with the TA. But it provided a little bit less insight into the very beginnings than I had hoped for, because of course an archive's only got the stuff in it that happened to be kept that made it into a donation. And so sort of on that side, I suspect there's probably a trip in my future to look at the Society of Authors archives, which are currently quite hard to get hold of because of the British Library hack, but they'll resurface in due course. On the sort of social side, I think there's a real fascinating element of social history. I think I rarely think I would like to time travel, but I've often thought that after World War II and into the 1950s and that era of, on the one hand, sort of quite gritty, everything's really gone quite badliness, but on the other hand, the optimistic reconstruction of a better Europe has always struck me as it must have been interesting and exciting to be part of. And you certainly get that impression from Patricia Crampton's papers. I think a biography would be better written by a family member who has got more stuff on hand, not least memories, but I think someone ought to. Also, if anyone's fishing for a PhD, I bet there is something very juicy about the people who were involved in Nuremberg as translators and interpreters, and this would certainly make a lovely chapter. But on the novel side, I have to desperately cling on to what Patricia Crampton said and say, I am a translator, not a writer. But I've spent long enough hanging around fiction that I translate that I've begun to see what can and can't work. And there's just about enough there in that archive and enough interesting gaps that I think there could be, a piece of quite nice fiction there. If anybody in this event goes away and writes it, I do expect a 3% royalty, but I don't ask for much.
You mentioned, Ian, that how kind of copious the archive is. I was interested when you talked latterly about Patricia Crampton's interest in the development of technology and writing that article already in 1979. It led me to think, I know it's one of the big issues for archives present, and you touched on it in your presentation as well, that in many ways an archive like Patricia Crampton's perhaps wouldn't arise these days, or would arise in a very different fashion because of the dominance of electronic files. And I was just wondering, did Patricia Crampton herself, did she use word processors?
She did. That's a very good question, actually. She was, I think, like many of us, I think she was very pro technology until she reached her breaking point, and then she didn't feel pro technology any longer. And so, sort of to take it backwards, and one of the really interesting facets of the archive is that Patricia didn't do email, even though she was in fact, she was with us well into the era of email, and that must have been at times rather annoying for her. That she was a letter writer and she was a faxer, and it took me a long time thinking about the tech. I wondered what all these, are all these flimsy pieces of paper, why is it all a bit faded? And it took this child of the late 80s a bit longer than it should have to clock that I was reading fax printouts. And so, I mean, in that respect, of course, there was the sort of the level of semi-instant communication going on. She was a word processor. She did type both on a typewriter and then later on a word processor. It's interesting to note that her preferred approach when she could facilitate it was actually to dictate. She would tape record a dictation, and as she felt she wasn't a very good typist, she then sent that out and it got typed up. And on the one hand, it sounds quite luxurious, but then on the other hand, I know I've got quite a lot of colleagues who will swear by packages like Dragon for dictating these days. So it's interesting to see that combination there. And I think that ultimately, you're right. It's how does the archive come about? And I think what's so interesting here is that you've got all the artifacts and documents of a professional freelance life, and when they're in paper form, if you've not chucked them out, they might make it. Where as anybody who's had the misfortune to work with me or collaborate with me knows, I'm a serial over emailer. I really hope no one's keeping them. But more pertinently, my approach to my own paperwork, if I, as a researcher or a committee person, is that as soon as I'm done with it, I throw it in the bin, which means that my own archive, I'm afraid, is mostly up here. So if anybody would like to do a project on me, they'll have to interview me while I'm still living. They can't wait for the papers to come out.
Ian, you reminded me, talking of Patricia not being an emailer, many moons ago when I was secretary of the Friedrich-Nietzsche Society, and our life president was R.J. Hollingdale, the great translator of Nietzsche and other German writers. And most of us on the committee were academics and had email, but Reg did not do emails. And so whenever I was calling meetings, I would have to put one printout of my email into an envelope and post it to him so that he would get it. He was a very assiduous attender of meetings, but not via email. We have a number of questions have been coming through. Thank you for these. Jane Davis says, obviously it's impossible to say, but did you get the impression that there was anything Patricia regretted about her career, or any author that she would have liked to translate?
I think not so much authors that she felt she had missed out on. I think she translated Lindgren and she liked translating Lindgren, and she was very pleased to have translated Lindgren. And I think the same with Dick Bruner and Miffy. I think to some extent, as a children's lit aficionado with the languages she had, I mean, she got some of the absolute highlights. So I think no misses. In terms of regrets, I'm not sort of well enough informed, but exactly her fiance Wolfgang Hildesheimer, where it was broken off in the 40s, and it was very sad, and the letters between them are just exactly, those are definitely not for reproduction here. They're for the biography, or for maybe for the novel if it's authorized. Those letters are heartbreaking, and just a wonderful insight into the human condition. And there were hints at how it felt to then end up crossing paths with him later on in life and translating his work when they were both, grown ups rather than, people knocking about as young things in Germany post-war. And there's even some correspondence between her and a researcher into Hildesheimer in Germany who wanted to write his biography, who basically said, I want to know everything. Tell me about him when he was young. And I think there, regrets or feeling a bit, I don't think there are any regrets at all that she translated his work, but I think it must have been a very unusual experience to have someone come back from your past like that and turn into such a material part of your professional present. Hope that answers the question, Jane.
A question from Vineet Lal. Clearly, Patricia's experience of translating at Nuremberg was a very singular and unique one, and unlikely, thankfully, ever to be repeated. Did you get the impression that Nuremberg in some way instilled in her a desire to champion the rights of the individual and therefore cement her support for collective action via the TA and SELTA?
I think in a way, yes, it must have done, and this is there's no easy thing to point at, and there's not a pull quote, and that's kind of why I haven't got one for you. But there are lots of little bits that you can point at, and you can see the hints of it. And I think that while in Nuremberg there were multiple teams who were providing translation, and they were in the American Palace in Nuremberg. So actually, 7 of the 8 teams were American, and the American groups were all largely Jewish refugees who had been in the States during the war and who then came back. And then there was the British group, which included her. And I think what we would say now, they worked hard and they played hard, which if you're being paid tax-free American money, you can understand. But I think in terms of the collective thing, the united front, the groups, the translator rights, yeah, I think that probably did instill in her this sense that if you're going to work hard, then there should be, there should be something that came out at the other end. And I think they worked, it was a very, exactly, unsettling is the word I picked for today. I think it was an unsettling experience what they were working on, but by being in that group. And, I'd say what's interesting is that, they took the view they would work harder Monday to Friday to avoid working weekends. Now, it's quite a simple one, but just I think there's a lot of that. And I think there's an awful lot of, they looked after each other and it helped them get through that peculiar experience. And I think it would be bizarre if that hadn't informed how she then went on to approach life as a solo translator and a freelancer. And I mean, none of us here were translators in Nuremberg, but most of us had definitely experienced the solitude of being a translator sort of stuck in the corner working on our stuff. And how we feel about that will always vary. Some really like it and some don't. For me, I'm sort of it's a 2 sides of the coin issue. I get my best work done when I'm on my own in peace and quiet, but I can't stand it. I hate being on my own. I join lots of clubs. And I think it's a sort of, what would we say, Vinny? We talk about wellness and mental health today, wouldn't we? I think in some ways, championing the rights of translators as individuals in a group, ensuring that they get, a decent fist of it in their bargains. It's about their wellness. It's about making sure that they don't sort of, go nuts. Hopefully that sort of answers the question.
Absolutely. Ian, there's a next question from Sarah Death, who you mentioned in your presentation. Sarah says, "Hi Ian, many thanks. Having only known Patricia in her older age, I've often found myself considering her approach to being an elder stateswoman in our SELTA circles, for example, and she became something of a role model for me in this regard. Did you find yourself pondering this as you looked at Patricia's life through the full span of the archives from ingénue to post-retirement?"
Yes. And in part because at least a couple of colleagues who also knew Patricia have described her in terms never negative, but certainly ones that suggest that they were perhaps a little intimidated by her. And I think older Patricia, I can certainly understand that, with her sort of stature and demeanor and her list of publications, you would be. But I think for me that what softened. This is a difficult question, right? Because I was born old, so sort of, I never had like a fun, youthful self, but that's where it really helped to have the stuff about her childhood and about her early years working in Nuremberg, because she's a beautiful woman in the pictures, but exactly, she's living a sort of an exciting life of a young, vibrant person, as you read this stuff. And I sort of thought it's a reminder that when you encounter anybody who might seem essentially, lofty and a little bit frightening and in their autumn years, that they were probably quite nice when they were young, and they're probably quite nice now too. And I think that that's very obvious when you then read her correspondence in the 80s and the 90s and even into the noughties on her various committees, that she said what she thought. And I think there'll be lots of people in this audience who go, oh yeah, she said what she thought. But I mean, it was all being said, in my view, it was all being said for the right reasons and in the right tone and in a quite nice way. She wanted the best for everyone. And I think for me, it was interesting because I some years ago, one of my early forays into sort of thinking about translators of yesteryear working with Swedish was to do a little presentation, and I wrote a small piece about the translator Joan Tate, who some will remember, and she was an even more prolific translator of Swedish than Patricia. And Joan went to Sweden in 1939 on holiday and got stuck there during the war, the sort of thing that people used to do. And similarly, when approaching her, she had a sort of reputation for looking, a little bit, grumbly and chain smoking. But it's very apparent that, she was a, pretty likable person. Once you'd finished coughing your way through the cloud of smoke. So I think it really helped to see her in the round with all the personal stuff. Because I mean, a lot of the other collections held in this archive, for example, don't contain those sorts of personal things. For instance, the very living translator Daniel Hahn has some items that are placed in this archive, but they're mostly related to proofs and editorial notes on work that he did 10, 20 years ago. And that's very interesting for people who are looking into other things. But Daniel's teenage diaries are not, to my knowledge, are not being held at the University of East Anglia.
Yes, they may yet come in, I suppose.
Yeah. If you're listening, Danny.
Ian, it's very interesting that you should mention Joan Tate, because we have a question from our emerita colleague, Janet Garton. Hello, Janet, who says, thanks, Ian, lots of food for thought. I was wondering about communications between Patricia and other elder stateswomen of Swedish-English translation, like Joan Tate and Mary Sandbach. Is there much correspondence in the archive?
There's not as much personal correspondence, and that was for me. I mean, I'm an eternal gossip, so I mean, it's a slight disappointment that you don't sort of get as much of that. Any correspondence, particularly in the later years, because quite a lot of the early stuff there is correspondence, and as I noted, actually there's a lovely cache of letters that Crampton wrote home from Sweden and from Germany and so on, because obviously mum and dad then kept them, and they were sort of, when she came back, they went into her personal collection. But in the later years, it tends to be, my finding was that the stuff that was correspondence tended to be transactional in one way or another. Something was going on rather than just the exchange of, as it were, personal news. And so you don't get as much communication with other individual translators as I had hoped, which is a pity, because I think that can give you, I think that the Swedish English space and indeed the Scandinavian English space that you're so familiar with as well, Janet, and obviously you knew Patricia, as it were, back in the day. I think it was a much smaller space, and it would have been very interesting to see how she negotiated the what might we say, almost the cramped confines of, not tons of work, but quite a few dominant personalities, because I think, we can certainly say Crampton and Tate were dominant personalities. But there's no hint of that. The only thing that I can offer is sort of, if I may, in short, is that there's a brief reflection in a letter. Excuse me. There's a brief reflection in a letter when a draft memoir written for Swedish Book Review has been run through translator Tom Geddes, just for sort of a second opinion and another memory as someone who's been present. And Tom's comment about the Bernard Shaw Prize in her original draft, he explains, no, Joan didn't want there to be a prize, but once she wasn't chair of SELTA, then we could have the prize. So I think the most I can offer you is an observation from the sidelines decades later that the eminent stateswomen held strong views, and you can still find traces of that when you dig around years later.
Would you, I don't know if it's possible to kind of gauge this, but what would you say is the balance between, should we say, official correspondence and papers in the archive and more personal material? Is it possible to gauge, would you say, or is the official material kind of infused with the personal as well?
I'd say there's probably sort of the overall volume, we might say sort of perhaps a quarter relates to earlier life and is effectively almost all personal, and then maybe, you know, a quarter again is kind of, she's written because she did lots of talks and wrote lots of articles. I say lots, but exactly, there were perhaps 3 or 4 from the mid 1980s onwards that were sort of personal reflective pieces, but she seemed to have a drafting process of writing quite a few drafts, and then 1 or 2 probably weren't published, is my conclusion. And so you've got various, I sort of picked and chosen various snippets here and there for today, because some bits never made the final cut anywhere, but you do find them sort of noted, and we have to assume that they're probably truthful. And then I'd say the rest is mostly exactly, it's more official stuff. But what's interesting, and it comes back to this whole changes in communication and email and not thing, that often you find, yes, regrettably, you know, it's absolutely, you know, none of this is for consumption here or in publication. There's all sorts of juicy stuff from the Translators Association and the Society of Authors, in which people, backbite behind other people's backs about, you know, oh, I read that paper that so and so circulated, you know, what a load of rubbish. There's some great stuff like that on the other hand provides you with a really good insight into what was going on, because if you only sort of looked at the minutes and the agenda, you know, as ever, it's all quite tame. It's only by seeing that stuff around the sides that you get the feel. But yes, then it's only a hint of personal stuff rather than being sort of, yeah.
Okay, thank you. A question from Heidi. I am assuming this is Heidi, our MA student at UEA, who says, thank you for your talk. The discussion of collaboration and relationships between translators resonated with me as an emerging translator. I'm interested what insights you've gleaned about how translators can best support each other.
Well, I think it's fair to say that from Crampton's papers and what I know of her, that I think she was, to a great extent, very unselfish with her time and her advice. And that was, for instance, that was very clear to me when, as I mentioned, Ros Schwartz dropped me a line just to say that she was looking forward to this, and how much Patricia had meant to her as a role model and mentor. And I think she was very unselfish with that. But I think with the framework of SELTA and the Swedish translators that I've been involved in since pretty much sort of exactly, I was just thinking about this. I sort of got scooped in very early. I sort of sneezed something in Swedish literary translation, and someone suggested I ought to join out of the blue, which is in a way, that's what you want, isn't it? And it's a little bit old school these days to have somebody swoop in and say, have you considered joining a club? But it's been sort of where I have gestated as a literary translator and have turned into a fully fledged, fully emerged translator. And I think that it's that unselfishness in general that's important, because ultimately you have, once you're into a single language pairing, of course, you've got the very awkward reality, which is that we're all in competition with each other. Nominally, you know, ultimately, if you don't get the job, somebody else will. But I think the key is, you know, ultimately, you can't think too hard about that. It's a bit gloomy, but also that still being, you know, unselfish, open and free with your advice and your tips, you know, makes us all better. And that, it's the double way, as a professional, I have to sort of chip in. Not only am I not a writer, I'm a translator, but I do this as a job. And much as I like translating, if all the work sort of dried up in my case, I'd go away and do something else. I might, scribble some translation by night to amuse myself, but I wouldn't do the full-time job unpaid. And I think that we are ultimately invested in sustaining both the enthusiasm for our chosen literature and for sustaining the reader market, and that being together and doing that is it's so much easier. I mean, can you imagine being like a one person hype machine for yourself and for your language pairing forever? Like, it's just exhausting. So I think we're stronger together as humankind. Is that a message of hope that we can tolerate today?
Absolutely. Ian, you talked of language pairings there, and there's a question from Bjarne Thompson, who says, "Hi, Ian, great presentation. Do we know if there were developments during Crampton's career as a translator in terms of which source languages and what types of literature she prioritized?"
I think there are hints in her papers that in later years, I think she shed most of the. I mean, there are so many languages going on, and there's a lovely glib comment somewhere that she messed something up in French, and then there's a throwaway comment saying, thank goodness I never much like translating French anyway. And in a way, you go, well, it's such a luxury to have so many source languages you work with that you can rage quit one of them and decide you're not going to do it any longer. And I think what we can probably say is that there were languages that were useful for work in the early days. I think German was an initial passion, even if she started with French first. I think there was an interest in Russian, and I think that probably kept her going sort of in those early years. But I suspect that the real passion was for Swedish and for the Scandinavian languages, and sort of Dutch as a sort of, I think, almost a South Scandinavian thing. The story behind her learning Dutch was that she had to go to Mexico on family business in the 1950s. So she picked up Spanish while she was there, and she went on a Dutch shipping line. So she learnt Dutch from the crew, which, I mean, if you take a trip to Mexico City now with KLM, I don't think there's an expectation that you have to learn Spanish and Dutch while you're away. So it's, different expectations. And while I think she then went on to do quite a bit of work with Spanish, I suspect even that flaked away. And Hindi, of course, was just what was it, where it was installed at birth, but not really a working language. And I think that the real passion really lay in the Scandinavian languages, and sort of German and Dutch as hangers on. And then, of course, once you cultivate your reputation somewhere, as the translator of Lindgren, as the translator of Anne Holm from Danish, as the translator of Miffy, you kind of you do end up a little bit typecast as a translator, which is not a bad thing if you're happy with that, but I think it does shape where you then go. And then, as a sort of as an aside, there's sort of a lovely bit. She translated Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki book, and it was suggested that she drop everything and come to stay at his place in Italy to translate that book with him next to her, because that would be nice, he said. And there are words to the effect of, yes, I'm sure it would be terribly nice. I have 2 young children. I'll be translating this from home. I don't know how that affects her relationship with Norwegian from there on.
Ian, we're running out of time. We've run out of questions from our audience, but I wonder if I could just ask you a final question myself. You've laid out in wonderful detail all the different areas of Patricia Crampton's activity as the translator in Nuremberg, her extensive as a literary translator, her really valuable work for the different organizations that she was not just involved with, but that she had real leadership roles with, and so on. I wonder whether what you would say is kind of her most important legacy, if it's possible to, again,
Oh,
to gauge that, because I can imagine that that might be through her translations of this author that have been super important in promoting that author's legacy, or in the much more kind of practical work. And she's clearly a woman who is very practical and enjoyed practicalities as well. The work that she did for the TA and other organizations. So
yeah,
it,
gosh, I was going to say how many singular sort of pinnacle items am I allowed on my mountaintop?
well,
I
that's
think
I mean
on
that's an acceptable answer too.
yeah, on the practice side, I think we can say I'm always, and this perhaps says more about me than anything, but we need readers, and so children's literature is very important, and I think that as a translator of children's literature of import for many years, working on such important texts and working with them so well, I think that that's very important because that's good books in themselves for good authors, but it turns out readers who go on to keep reading in life and indoctrinate their children to keep reading, and it makes them open-minded to translation, and those are all those are that's very important. But I'd say, and I suspect there are some people who might be um, stomping their feet in the audience if I don't say it, and I'd be inclined to say that where the longest term impact has been had, and I'm a firm believer in, of course, that small incremental work in groups and clubs and institutions can change our lives for the long run. But I think there are two things sort of hand in hand that have had a massive impact on a lot of people in over the years, and that is ensuring that translator copyright was something that was respected by British publishers. It didn't used to be. That's not the case in other countries still that it is. There are other countries that don't really think translators should get copyright. It's pretty much the norm here in the UK, and it's a big deal for us. Um, and it can pay off, and I'd say sort of hand in hand with that public lending right in itself, a massive deal for anybody with works in public libraries, an even bigger deal that she was in the room and effectively ensured that if you've translated a title and it's in a British library, you're getting 1/3 of the royalty when that's being borrowed. And we can retranslate Dick Bruner and Astrid Lindgren, and indeed in the case of Lindgren, Oxford University Press has been busy churning out new translations because the classics need it. But Crampton will always have been there in getting us public lending right money and in getting us copyright. I think those are two very big things.
Thank you, Ian. You talked about the importance of being unselfish, and I think we've benefited from your unselfishness today with this wonderful presentation and um, your unselfish responses to all of the questions. Thank you to everyone who put questions to Ian. Can I just say that our next research seminar will take the form of a book launch seminar in November, on the 20th of November, and that will be a book launch for our UEA colleague Philip Wilson's new book on translation and mysticism. But for today, we need to wrap up. Thank you to all our audience, and thank you, Ian, for a wonderful presentation and for such generous answers to all our questions. I hope you write that novel about Patricia Crampton one of these days, but even without the novel, even without the biography, I'm sure we all know a huge amount more now, and thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thanks for having me.